Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Grad Coach TV, where we demystify and simplify the oftentimes complex and perplexing world of academic research. Today, two of our seasoned dissertation coaches, David Phair and Alexandra Shaeffer, will be talking about 7 of the most common mistakes that they see in the results chapter, sometimes also called the findings chapter of dissertations and theses. This discussion is based on one of the many posts over on the Grad Coach blog. So if you are writing up your dissertation, thesis, or research project, you'll want to check out the Grad Coach blog over at www.gradcoach.com/blog. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your research project, whether that's a dissertation, thesis, or any other formal academic research project, you might be interested in our one-on-one private coaching service. You can learn more about that and book a free consultation with one of our friendly coaches over at gradcoach.com.
So today we're talking about the 7 common mistakes that frequently come up in a results chapter. Today we're taking a qualitative and quantitative focus, so we're really touching on a bit of both aspects. And as I said, 7 mistakes. The first mistake is when students interpret the results instead of presenting and describing them. And this happens quite often, and it's something we definitely see a lot of as coaches. Alexandra, what can you tell us about how to present and describe your results?
Sure, thanks for that. And it's nice to see you again, David. I agree that it is kind of natural in my experience, especially as a beginning researcher, when you have your data to just not only want to present it, but also you get so excited you want to tell them about it as well. So it's very important to wrap your mind around the fact that the purpose of your results chapter is to present and describe solely, and you're going to leave the interpretation for the discussion chapter. And so what that means is in this findings chapter, we should just be seeing kind of the presentation of the data. Tell us exactly what happened, show us the data, but don't tell us or interpret the data yet until the discussion chapter. This is a chance for you to show the reader, in the previous chapter methodology, I told you what I was going to do. I collected the data, and here's what happened, and here it is. And so it's really important to just, go against maybe that intuition to want to tell you what this means. Save it for the discussion chapter. Your findings, just present and describe.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And as you said, we all have that intrinsic desire to just jump into it and really get to grips with it. But think about it this way as well. You're really trying to show an objective view of the data you collected before any sort of subjectivity or any other aspects of your personal research bias comes in. So it's just about presenting the results of the methodology, as you said. One of the other things to keep in mind as well is some dissertations and thesis structures are different. Universities differ. So some of them have a findings chapter or a discussion and results chapter, and that's a completely different ball game. In that case, there you're meant to really present the result and interpret it. You're describing the results and then taking it a step further and relating it to your research aims and objectives. I know from a quantitative perspective, sometimes it's really important to at least in your results section state clearly whether your hypothesis was accepted or rejected, but no interpretation. It's just presenting that.
I think that's great, especially with the quant. With the qual, which is an inherently interpretivist or biased subjective methodology oftentimes, it's important to kind of avoid that temptation to really write about what it means and try to be as objective and structured as you can. And later in this video, we'll talk about some ways that you can do that with qual to ensuring that it's very structured, as black and white and neutral as possible.
So secondly, we see that students and clients frequently include irrelevant and non-essential analyses. And so really this is about making sure that your analyses that you're presenting fit the bill. Alexandra, how can we get that right?
Yes. So again, kind of going back to the first one, these kind of natural feelings that we have to get excited about our data, because let's be honest, collecting data is very stressful. And when you do it, you're very proud and enthusiastic. So I get it. But what I would say here is that it's very important to only include the relevant and essential and value adding parts to the analysis. And so you might be curious, okay, how do I judge what is essential, what is value adding? And a good rule of thumb for that is to think, does this directly, explicitly relate to my research aim or research question? Is there a one-to-one connection there? And if there isn't, if it feels a little bit like a digression, then it probably is. And so I would say that what you should do here is not only refer back to your research aim to make sure that the data that you're reporting is aligned with it, but also another trick you can do is look back in your methodology chapter and say, okay, what did I say I was going to do? What did I say I was going to include? And follow that. You were smart enough to include your methodological approach and intended analysis methods in your methodology chapter, so stick to it. But again, I completely understand where you're coming from with wanting to report what seems like interesting, but if it's not essential or not relevant, it may not actually end up adding the value that you think it adds to your analysis chapter. So that's some advice I would give you for that.
I think that's a really good point. And it's also worth noting that these kind of cases are where an appendix actually comes into play. By definition, the appendix should not be anything that is necessary for the findings, but that's where the interesting stuff can come up. And it's going to come up because that's research. We don't know what we don't know, and we find really interesting things. Similar to what you said as well, Alexandra, is I think it's really important to relate it back to the research question. But particularly in some cases, certain results are required to build onto further sections. So for instance, descriptive statistics or the calculation of specific variables, sometimes you'll need to present something that isn't directly related to your research question in order to get to that. And that's where it gets a little bit harder to make this litmus test. And again, you've got to say, what am I doing with this data and how am I using it to answer the question? And so there it gets a little bit more difficult, but broadly speaking, you've got an appendix, you can use it. You've got a supervisor, most of the time they're pretty helpful. And then if nothing else, it's okay to leave a little bit out, but don't leave out any information that's necessary for your report. So for instance, if you haven't included something that answers your third research question, that's a problem. So make sure to address that.
Definitely. And if I could just, loop back in about the qualitative side, you mentioned the quantitative. For the qualitative, again, we understand that it's inherently subjective. Everyone agrees with you there. But you need to think about, do I really need this to talk about this aspect of my qualitative data? Is that truly what I was trying and setting out to answer or investigate when I set out my research aim and research question? And if it doesn't, you can certainly talk about it in a later chapter, but it doesn't belong, or the appendices, as you said, David, but it doesn't necessarily belong there in the results chapter. So I think that's the advice I would give for the qual side.
All right, so the third mistake that we see, it's a little rarer, but that's including analysis methods or stat tests that are fancy and complicated instead of relevant. And as I said, it's a little rarer, but we see it happen, and I know I've been tempted to do it as well. Alexandra, what can you tell us about this one?
Yes, and so I think if I can put myself in the shoes of a beginning researcher or a graduate student nearing, let's say, their semi-final year, it is very tempting to want to take something that sounds very fancy or something that you read in an article that sounded very good and was really exciting, and other people were doing it for super cool projects, it's very tempting to think I should do that too. But just because something is fancy or complex, or the studies that have used it are really cool, doesn't necessarily mean that it's appropriate for your research. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with choosing a method, an analysis method or a stats method that is suitable, but maybe a bit quote unquote easy. And by easy, I mean, not the bells and whistles that you see in the other one. And so it's very important to quiet that voice in your mind that says, well, no, it needs to be very complex. There's nothing wrong. And it's actually better to use a stats test that is reliable in terms of it works. But it's a little bit less convoluted and less complex, because it will give you the results that it will measure and provide the results that you set out to approach when you set out your research aims and questions. There's nothing wrong with that. It's better to do something smaller and do it very well than to do something very complex or very overwhelming and only scratch the surface or do it poorly in the worst case.
Yeah, I think that's really a great point. Often enough, simple can be better.
Mm-hmm.
And so this often comes up a little bit, we're touching on the methodology chapter as well, but sometimes you need to actually take a step back and say, do I need to do all this complexity to get my answer? Or if I look at my research aim, can I get away with just a simple t-test? And it's really about making that correct assessment. And similarly, we see this come up a lot with students coming in looking to use a mixed method approach. They want to do quantitative and qualitative. And really, at this point, it's better to just take one methodology, apply it soundly and in depth, and that'll get you a lot more support than trying to, do all the things, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. If I can give another example of what you're saying, is I've had students come in and clients I've worked with who say that they want to prove or disprove a theory. And, that is a great motivation, good on you. But it's important to think, I am not going to prove or disprove a theory with my one study. I'm just not. And so it's better to take an approach that is simple and do it very well, and leave breadcrumbs for future researchers to pick up where you left off. So maybe, yes, eventually you will get closer to proving or disproving that theory, maybe, but it's not all on you. And so it's very important to do something simple and do it very well. And that is much better than trying to take a huge bite out of something and only scratch the surface or do it poorly.
All right, so results section mistake number 4 is a killer. And that's over-relying on tables, charts, and graphs instead of just relying on your text. So, Alexandra, how can we improve our usage of tables here?
Definitely. And, we were just speaking about this, but I think that it's very, there might be a few things going on when a client or a student does this, where they rely on these tables and charts and don't really write or present it in writing enough. And a lot of that is sometimes they're unsure of what the data is saying. And so what happens a lot of times in one case is that they'll just put all of those there and move on, because maybe I don't know what it means, right? And so it is wonderful to have these visualizations in form of table, charts, and graphs. They really do help the reader and yourself understand what happened as you present and describe the data. But not only do you need those figures and tables, etc., but you also need to tell us, describe what's happening. So you can present the data in these tables and charts and describe what's happening. Again, not interpreting, we already talked about that, but really, not shying away from adding some text to this. So this goes back to the importance of kind of creating a clear text-based narrative. The text should be able to stand on its own, and it's those tables and figures and graphs that will complement, support, exemplify the text. So it's almost like, give us the text, tell us what happened, present and describe, And then boom, here is a table or graph of that. And when you do it that way, especially in quant, it really clarifies what happened for the reader, but it also allows you to better prepare yourself for how you're going to write about and interpret these in the discussion chapter. So I'm getting carried away here. David, why don't you add something to this?
Yeah, so I think you really raised some great points, and I couldn't agree more. But really here, the importance is that each table and figure needs to be value adding, and it has to be covered in the text. You can't have any results coming up that aren't covered in the main text, or at least explicitly linked to the table. For instance, the descriptive statistics are, and then you can really dive into them and then say, see table 1. So that's really helpful there. Another one to think about is the opposite way as well. I know I frequently see lots of students come in with just a wall of text. Yes. And often enough, there's a table that you can use that can help facilitate that. But be wary, because once you go down the table hole, you can't get out. You know, there's tables for everything, a figure for everything. Similarly as well, is instead of having 4 bar graphs of the same pattern, but just 4 different cases or sites, make a compound figure. It's much more helpful to keep all that information in one place. And really, it can save on word count. You don't need 4 different captions. And it can save on space and page numbers as well. And I know from a qualitative perspective as well, tables and figures are less frequent, and they can be really helpful when used. But again, too many can be a little problematic.
Definitely. I appreciate what you're saying about the quant and your mention of qual. Another example that you might consider when doing qual is, you know, with qual, it's very easy to want to rely heavily on the text. But like you said, adding those tables and charts, and these you can get to using qualitative coding software or other types of qualitative software such as NVivo. They offer a lot of really excellent resources on NVivo for helping you create these tables, charts, graphs. And they will, as you said, they'll give you all of the examples. And so it's very important to be selective and think about, how is this table going to complement what I've written? And so again, I think what we're both saying here, it's important to be thoughtful about your use of tables, charts, and graphs with the text.
Definitely. And I mean, we always come back to it as well. Refer to your aims and objectives. We want to make sure that story is uniform throughout. All right, then for mistake number 5, we often see students providing poor or incorrect tables, charts, and graphs. And this is a tough one. So Alexandra, any advice or assistance you can provide here?
Yes, definitely. So as opposed to our point 4, where we talked about, you know, relying too heavily on these tables, charts, and graphs rather than texts, sometimes we'll see not only are you relying too much, but your choice of the type that you choose is not quite doing what you hope it's doing. So it's not necessarily directly addressing your research aim, as we've harped on about throughout this video. And so in addition to having too many charts and graphs, which can often be overwhelming, as we said in point number 4, but if you don't choose the right ones, then it's kind of, not to be too negative, but it's almost, you know, pointless in a way. I mean, that might sound extreme, but if the table and the graph and the figure aren't doing what you've intended them to do, and you haven't really thought about what they're supposed to do, then it's not going to make for a very clean and cohesive and coherent presentation in your findings chapter. And so in this case, there are some ways to really think about, okay, this is my data, this is my research aim, how will I visually present that? And so there's oftentimes, if you think about, you know, are you trying to show a relationship? Are you trying to show a description? There are a set number of visualizations of tables, charts, and graphs that are best suited for each particular type of aim. And so, we've harped on about that in this video, but really being thoughtful and thinking about how your reporting of the findings and your description of them, how it's aligning with what you said your research aim was all throughout your project.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Alexandra. I think one of the other things that comes up frequently is poor labeling of charts and graphs and tables. And there are some really strict rules here. For instance, every table or graph should have a caption, and that caption needs to provide enough information that you could interpret that picture without the associated main text. And so that's really important to get right. You want to make sure the caption is in the right place for your specific format style, and you really want to ensure that you're covering all the aspects of the study. Mm-hmm. Also, as Alexandra mentioned, there are specific forms that really work for specific options. If you want to, for instance, show a relationship, you definitely want to go with a scatter plot. But if you're looking for a distribution, that's going to be a line graph. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you're presenting parametric or normal data, go with a bar plot with standard errors. But if you're using non-parametric or non-normal tests, use a box plot. And so there's a whole bunch of these rules, and they're pretty complex. So really stick with what's been done before. But to help you out, we do have a chart suggester on the GradCoach blog. So do consider taking a look at that. We'll put a link down in the description down below. But it will really just help you with that process of making choices on what to present for what.
Absolutely. And another piece of advice I would add, in addition to looking at the awesome chart that we have, would be oftentimes these data softwares or programs such as your Microsoft Excels, your NVivos, they would, once you enter your data, they will try to help you by recommending certain graphs or charts or tables. And it can be very tempting to want to select one of those because they're recommending it to you and they're the experts, so I should do what they're telling me to do. But again, that's, they aren't familiar. They haven't been sitting with the data and the project like you have for months or years even. So really think thoughtfully about which visualization methods are suitable and appropriate for your data.
I think that's really helpful. One of the other things that I know is also important to keep in mind is sometimes less is better, and that relates to tables and figures as well. We're tempted to make them super busy, have all of the information on the figure, and that can be really difficult. So really try to keep it to the point, answering the question, providing that support that's necessary. And in the form of tables, really take advantage of white space. It really makes a difference in improving the quality of a table that you're presenting. All right, so mistake number 6 is pretty problematic, and it's a major one. And that's where students shape or misinterpret the data to achieve their preconceived or preferred outcomes. Alexandra, as I mentioned, this one can be really problematic. What can we do to avoid this kind of mistake?
Yes, so I don't think that, starting from ground level, I don't think any of us set out to have a project whose results are not significant or are not groundbreaking. We are inherently idealistic, oftentimes going into graduate school and wanting to be researchers because we want to better the field of whatever field we're in and make a contribution. So that motivation is perfectly understandable. But as we've talked about in this video, your findings chapter is really just to present and describe the data. It's not to jump ahead and interpret it. It's not to make assumptions that, something amazing happened. Something amazing could have happened, but it's maybe not what you thought or intended it would be. And so if we can leave you with kind of one piece of advice is just to let the data be what it is. Don't try to make it fancy. Don't try to over convolute it. Just show us what you have. And I think, David, you have a great story about, kind of what it how it still can be exciting if your results are not what you thought they were going to be, and especially in terms of significance.
Yeah, definitely. So someone I knew while I was doing my master's had a project where absolutely nothing worked. The experiments didn't work, the statistical tests were not significant, and they were really worried. But they had a really good supervisor who came alongside them. And so they realized that even though the results were not significant, they could really unpack why they thought it wasn't significant. And we're getting a little into the discussion side of things, but broadly speaking, they had no significant result. And they ended up with a distinction because they'd done such a good coverage of that issue. So really, don't be afraid of non-significance. It happens quite more often than not, because unfortunately, as a result of publication, non-significant results are harder to publish. And so there's almost this bias for us to find significance. Similarly, don't be afraid of contrary findings or even supporting what happens in the literature. As I said, let the data speak for itself. You've collected this data, you've put your blood, sweat, and tears into getting it. And so you want to present it as is. Similarly as well, I've known some people have come into their results chapter with preconceived ideas or expectations for what they'd like it to be. And so that means that you start thinking about, maybe I don't include this result. And that's a really bad place to be. Generally stick to what you set out to do and present that data, and you'll be better off for it.
Definitely. And that's a big no-no. Don't try to hide it. Show us what happened. And as you said, sometimes when the results are different from what we anticipated or hypothesized in quant studies, it's very interesting, and you can write more about it in your discussion section, which we'll talk about in a later video. But it leaves future researchers the opportunity to see this as well, for them to conduct their study. So thinking about this thing that we thought was a given, maybe isn't. And more people can build on, well, why that is, and is that always the case, or was this just in this one study? So it's very interesting. And in the case of qualitative, especially when we're doing kind of case studies or interviews, we often have an idea going into it of what the results will be. We think that if we interview certain people or do a case study on an organization, that these are the findings that we're going to get. And that's not always the case, right? So with qualitative, especially, people are complex. We're not black and white. And so just, again, if we can underline this again, is just present the data for what it is. Don't shy away from it. And don't be scared if it's not significant in terms of the statistical.
Lastly, and this mistake is important to avoid for most dissertation chapters, but specifically in the results as well. Mistake number 7 is having a poor structure and flow. Alexandra, structure is important, flow is important. What can we do to make sure that these exist and benefit our study?
Yes. So as you said, if we could even zoom out on the whole dissertation or thesis project, your whole dissertation and thesis should have a structure and flow. It is a coherent and cohesive unit. If we look in particular at the findings chapter, there are, we could say, 3 core aspects of the structure. There needs to be a chapter introduction, there needs to be a body section, and there needs to be a concluding summary. So in the first part, the chapter introduction, you need to remind the reader again, you're constantly doing this, but you need to remind them again of your research question, the research aim, and tell them how this chapter, the findings chapter, is structured. What is the order in which the information will appear? And kind of that shows how it's going to flow. And so you're setting out in that introduction that you have the structure and this flow, and now you have to make good on it and actually give us that structure and that flow. So the body section then is really kind of the core, the meat and potatoes of this findings chapter, whereas the concluding summary is that kind of nice transition. It lays the foundation for the next chapter, where you will really, in the next chapter, tell us, okay, you presented the findings here. What does it mean? And so those are kind of the macro aspects of the findings chapter, but there are some differences sometimes in terms of how it's organized for quantitative and qualitative. So David, why don't you take the quantitative first?
Definitely. That broad macro structure that you spoke about is super important, really, particularly in quantitative research, starting off with that clear statement of your research aims and objectives, and then that leads nicely and guides the way you're going to move through your research. So the standard research project is going to start off with the descriptive analysis, and that's really talking about what data you collected and really presenting it. And that's super important because your research is your specific context. And it's important to know what population did you sample, where did you sample, when did you sample, from an experimental procedure, what was your temperature and humidity. These are all kind of aspects that you need to first present to set the scene. And then you can dive into the more detailed coverage. So you deal with your population, then you deal with your actual measures. For instance, if you've done a survey to assess job satisfaction, you're going to want to present some data on what you found. What was the overall job satisfaction? What was the overall commitment to the company? And then from that point, you can then go further into the inferential statistics. If you're doing that, if that's necessary for your study, where you then dive into the specifics of the relationships between variables. But it's really important to make sure that you follow that structure, that you're not introducing information that hasn't been set up before. And so in a quantitative research, it's really important to do that. And then again, at the summary, that concluding section, to really refer back to those aims, objectives, and hypotheses, if you have them. You need to say whether you accepted them or rejected them, because that's really important for transitioning into your discussion chapter, where you will then unpack that. And the qualitative is pretty much the same, but very different. So Alexandra, same, but different. Also.
Yes, absolutely. So I think that's easy to think about, well, if I'm doing qualitative, I don't have this kind of structure of presenting the results, and that's a false assumption. So with qualitative, what I tell my clients all the time is you need to impose as rigid and objective as a structure as possible to kind of not make up for the fact, but complement the fact that your findings and your project are inherently interpretivist. So oftentimes what that looks like in the findings chapter is you have your chapter introduction, and then in the body section, you want to take a macro approach first. Let's say you're doing a thematic analysis. So the macro approach is, what are the big themes that you're looking at in your project? Let's say you did interviews. You know, there are times where you have preconceived, set out themes if you're doing thematic analysis, or if you're doing grounded theory, you develop those themes yourself from the data. And so present those broad macro themes. And then what you can do from within there is break down those themes into the smaller sub themes or the smaller patterns that fit within that theme, and give examples. And then you move on to the next theme and the next theme, following the same pattern there. And so doing it that way will help you avoid the idea of, I'm just presenting a wall of text. And actually, I have grouped these together in a broad scope and a zoomed in sense. And it will really lend your findings chapter to a very kind of rigorous interpretation for your discussion chapter next. So it is absolutely possible and expectable to have a similar structure with qualitative research.
That's really helpful. Thanks, Alexandra. One of the other things that I know is also helpful, and this is relating more to the flow rather than the structure, is to really think about how you introduce figures, tables, how you work your way through results. I remember my supervisor when I was studying my PhD would tell me, don't just give me the numbers, tell me a story. And she was really key at pushing that idea that the main text when you're reporting statistics or discussing something is about building that story, not interpreting, but presenting the results in a way that's accessible, because we don't just want that wall of numbers, and we want a table or a figure when it comes up to be introduced, to be unpacked, and then presented as a visual representation. And so it's really important to think through that. And then lastly, on flow, take advantage of transition sentences. If one idea is linked to another, make that transition sentence work for you in your results chapter, because we want to make it more accessible, right?
I have one tiny piece of advice too, if I can jump in here.
Go for it.
So one of the things that happens a lot, because I've done it too, and I see it with my clients, when you are writing the actual description parts in your findings and you're trying to refer to a table, it's very easy to say, see table 7 below, or see table 7 above, putting those prepositions of above or below there. But oftentimes what happens is that as you go through multiple edits of your chapter, the actual presentation of where the table is might change. So a good rule of thumb, just a tiny piece of advice, don't put those words like above or below, just put the table number, and it will save a lot of headache for your reader, for you, and it will increase the flow. It's a tiny piece of advice, but it really adds to the polished nature of it. Yeah.
All right. So that's the 7 mistakes that commonly come up of a results chapter. And again, just to be clear, this is a results chapter by itself. Some universities will put them together with a discussion in a findings chapter, but really this isn't all of the mistakes, but there are 7 key ones. So thank you so much, Alexandra, for your help today. It's really great chatting to you and getting your insight into what clients and students can do to avoid some of these pitfalls when they're working on their results chapter.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Always a pleasure. And it was fun to go back and forth with the quant and qual with you. And hopefully we help some of you viewers at home.
All right, so that pretty much wraps up this episode of Grad Coach TV. If you're wanting to learn more about the results chapter or the findings chapter, or want to learn more about how to write up that chapter for your dissertation or thesis, be sure to check out the Grad Coach blog over at gradcoach.com/blog. Also, if you're looking for a helping hand with your research project, be sure to check out our one-on-one private coaching service where you can work with a personal coach just like David or Alexandra, and they'll help you step by step through your research project. If you're interested in that and want to learn more, you can visit gradcoach.com, where you can find all the details and also book a free consultation with one of our friendly coaches. So that's all for today. Until next time, good luck.